Welcome back to the Mad Podcast. Today, my guest is Erik Bernhardsson, the CEO of Modal Labs, a fast-growing serverless platform for AI engineers. We started the conversation with a broad overview of the compute layer of the AI stack.
More recently, there's been a bunch of newfangled, I call them like the alt clouds, CoreWeave, Lambda.
Then covered Modal in terms of product, use cases.
Model inference is the majority of our use case. People using us for batch, people using us for large-scale video encodings, building web services.
And go-to-market.
To just turn out that targeting early data influencers, talking about the product, giving away hats online on Twitter, that's always worked for us.
And then close with a bunch of lessons learned, building technical products and technical teams.
In the early days, you can get very far with almost no management if you just hire fairly smart people and just give them the context.
Erik is a very insightful founder with a great blog and Twitter content. Please enjoy this very thoughtful conversation. Hey, Erik, welcome.
Thank you. It's exciting to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to do this. As I was prepping for this, I was on your website looking at the list of angel investors that you've had, and I think we've had just about everyone, at least on the angel side on your cap table. So we had Bar from Monte Carlo on the pod. We had Barry from Hex. We had just recently Jordan from Mother Duck. Tristan from DBT. I'm probably forgetting one or two, but it's funny, like the whole group. So it was long overdue that.
It's like the data influencer.
That's the thing, data influencer. Okay. So you are the CEO of Modal Labs, building a fantastic infrastructure company right here in New York. Let's start with a quick elevator pitch, like the 30 or 45-second version of what Modal Labs does.
Yeah, so Modal makes it easy to build, scale, and deploy applications in the data, AI, machine learning realm. So we basically, you can think of it as like we take, you write a bit of Python code and we take that code, we stick it in a container, we execute that in the cloud in a way we don't have to think about infrastructure. You don't have to think about GPUs, you don't have to think about, the cloud vendors. We just magically make that work and scale it to very large, thousands of GPUs potentially.
I thought a fun way to start the conversation to make it interesting to a broad group of people would be to talk about the AI compute space in broad strokes. So, like people have heard of GPUs, obviously. People have heard of GPU clouds. Maybe people have heard of like inference clouds and platforms, and they've heard of NVIDIA, Modal Labs, Grok, Lambda, CoreWeave, all those companies. If you had to categorize the space, like who does what, the different approaches, what would you say? How would you explain it to somebody that wants to learn about the space?
Yeah, and by the way, I think it's funny because it's like the typical VC, like, what's the market map? And my role is like, there is no, like, we defy it, like, we do all of it.
Yes. And I'll say, as a claim to fame, in your blog post that introduced Modal Labs, whenever that was 3 years ago, you hyperlinked my market map as a way of showing the nonsense in the space.
No. I don't think it was the nonsense. I think I was just pointing out how much stuff there's. I love your market map, by the way. There used to be like,
I'm going to take this and I'm going to clip it and have it in the short.
Okay,
Erik
awesome.
loves my market map.
I love the
people
market.
For the record.
I built, we will get back to that later. I built a thing called Legion many years ago, and it used to be kind of, you could see it, but
yes.
like every year it's getting like smaller and smaller. I don't know if it's still, but every time it comes out, I zoom in and I try to find it. And
Luigi's still in there.
It's still in there.
Yeah.
Nice. I love it even more now. Anyway, going back to like, what does the market map look like? So there's obviously the clouds, right? Like AWS, GCP, Azure, etc. Oracle, I should shout out to Oracle. I actually like them a lot. We use them. Big fan. So they, I think, I've been there for a long time and I've been doing a phenomenal job building, sort of primitives for running stuff in the cloud. More recently, there's been a bunch of sort of newfangled, I call them like the alt clouds. CoreWeave, Lambda, what are the other ones? There's like FluidStack, there's Vultr, there's a lot of them, right? Like they're sort of, as it turns out with like GPUs, what people really care about is like, they just want a box with the GPU in many cases. And so, that's something that's like a little bit more like of a commodity and I think a little bit easier to build, and arguably, they would probably disagree with this. So I think we've seen a sort of, renaissance of like, or like not a renaissance, but like a bunch of new sort of cloud entrants, like, sort of competing with the hyperscaler, focusing more on just like only GPU availability.
And so those I just I'm a developer. If I want access to a GPU, instead of buying my own GPU, I go to those clouds, and there will not be much else, but there will be what I need.
It's like, they provision a box with a GPU and you can SSH into it, right? So it's like sort of like you get a GPU on your desk. But
so those people are in the sort of data center business, meaning that they will have the GPU farms and the electricity.
Yeah, it's like sort of like almost like real estate, right? Like they own sort of, real estate and they rent it out, arguably, sort of, WeWork, you could say, if you want to be, a little cynical. But like not a ton of value like higher up in the stack, which is like, I think where we play is slightly higher up in the stack. I think like if you go up in a stack, start looking at like more like applications or infrastructure as a service. There's like a few different providers. There's first of all, there's a whole bucket of all the LLM inference providers. So there's OpenAI, Anthropic. Then there's a few ones focusing on open source models. So Fireworks, Together, I think Anyscale to some extent, Replicate, etc. So those I would put in the LLM bucket, and then there's like a slightly adjacent bucket, I would say, of like more like AI as an API, and actually that probably more like where I would put Replicate. I also put FAL in there. I think we occupy a slightly different bucket, which is more like you're not using model through an API. You write code. Like we're all about like taking users' arbitrary code and running it in the cloud, right? Like we're a serverless compute platform. So we take your code, we execute it in the cloud. Like you can run whatever code you want. In many cases that involves a GPU, in many cases not. In that space, I think there's like less of an obvious. I would say like Base 10, maybe to some extent, is like somewhat similar to us. Like they focus only on model inference. We do model inference. Model inference is probably the majority of our use case. But we also have many other use cases. Like we have people using us for batch. We have people using us for large scale like video encodings or building web services or all kinds of other stuff. And then I don't know what other boxes should I talk about that we didn't cover.
I think that's pretty much it. At the very beginning, there would be just like the pure hardware. So
sure,
the NVIDIAs and Cerebras, which people can still use direct, obviously, without any of those cloud solutions. But that's a whole different level of effort.
Yeah. And you mentioned Grok. It's not like an area I'm like, we're playing in, and but I do find it like super fascinating, right? Like, traditionally all these like LLM inference, providers have obviously been building on H100s or, NVIDIA GPUs. But I do think it's kind of fascinating how it's like kind of going in the same direction as like crypto mining towards more like specialized hardware. Cerebras is another one. So I think it's sort of interesting to see, for LLM, I think like the reason like why it's happening for LLM is like, it's like a kind of well-defined API. It's like text in, text out. And it works really well. And it's sort of, a few big models like dominate everything. The spaces where we tend to compete and where we have most of our customers is like more like very custom models, like people training their own proprietary video models, image models, like audio, things like that, or having very custom workflows. And there's like less of sort of like, power law there. Like there's like, thousands of models, like everyone has like their own slightly different models. And that's where we focus is like, if you have, your own custom model, you're probably really good at like training models and building applications, but we handle all the infrastructure. So, all the like auto scaling and all the, making sure utilization is maximized and all these things.
Yeah. And by the way, still at a very high level, all of this revolves around the fundamental concept that people are going to want to build their own models, which, if you listen to some people would say, well, it's all going to be provided for you as an API and you're never going to have to worry about this. But you obviously believe in a world where that is not true and people are going to want to build their own AI.
I mean, I don't know. Like, I don't know if I necessarily believe in it, but I certainly bet on it. Like, I think there's some sort of, existential risk that there's like such a good multimodal model that people just use it for everything, right? It's like a model to rule it all. I don't know if that's true. Like, I tend to think it's probably less likely to happen than other people. Because like, having seen so many like custom, very, all the idiosyncrasies around like building like custom models. Like, let's say you want to, build like a voice cloning thing, right? Like, probably like a multimodal model is not going to care about all the specific things around that, right? Like, so I don't know. I'm a big believer that like, in the long run, like people will train a lot of different custom models. Mm-hmm. Well, even though like the multimodal models may handle even more stuff. I mean, the pie is growing. I guess like it's like general like statement of like software engineering in the last 30 years, but like the pie always gets bigger.
You mentioned Luigi a minute ago. What was your journey into Modal? What did you do before? And what was the path to starting the company?
Yeah, so I've done a bunch of different things, but in particular, I was at Spotify for 7 years, and I built a thing called Luigi, which was a workflow scheduler. So this is sort of problem I tried to solve at Spotify was we had a lot of different batch jobs, and you ended up with like very complex graph. You need to run like hundreds of different jobs in a certain sequence and sort of very parametric ways. And so I built Luigi to sort of help us figure that out, like how to execute all of it in like correct order. Open sourced it. A bunch of people started using it. I think this is like 2011. Then I like stopped really caring about it in 2015. Like Airflow kind of took over, and then like later now there's like Daxter and Prefect and Flight and a bunch of other ones. I mean, I still think it's a good idea, and like kind of related to like how I ended up starting Modal. Like part of how Modal came to be is I actually started looking again at workflow scheduling in late 2020 when I realized I wanted to start something or build something. And started thinking a lot about like, what makes a good workflow schedule. I even built one. I have some like janky code on my laptop. I realized at some point, like a workflow schedule is only as good as like the sort of underlying compute layer. Like, because at the end of the day, you need like to sort of, you can't just like describe the work you need to do. You also need to describe the code. You also need to write the code. And if that like integration point is bad, if it doesn't, if you have like kind of a, like a system where you have to like define the workflow over here and the application code over here, like you're never going to have a great experience. So I was actually, I'm just going to stop working on the workflow scheduling. I'm going to focus all on the compute provider instead. And what makes a good compute provider? And I realized what I want is, I just want something that like lets me define application code in Python, because I was very focused on like data, AI, machine learning applications, and let this infrastructure handle all the rest, like all the scaling, all the provisioning, all the resource management, all that stuff. And I just got obsessed and carried away. And 3-4 years later, now I have a company around it. But that's sort of genesis of Modal. So it kind of started with Luigi in a way.
Yeah, because originally the plan was to create tools for data engineers and data scientists, and the whole AI and GPU. You evolve with the market, right?
Is that what I told you a long time ago?
No, I don't know, but that sounds good.
No, I feel like we had a conversation many years ago, and I probably said something like that.
You tell me, but yeah, I do seem to remember that like at the beginning. And when did you start the company? In 2020?
Yeah, like early 2021, really.
That was the time when what was top of mind, I think, for a lot of potential customers were more like data infra. And it was
pre-Gen AI.
Yeah, pre-Gen
exactly.
AI.
So it's a little bit different. And yeah, I think that's always been the ethos of the company is like, I kind of at the end of the day just want to build better tools for data, AI, machine learning teams. And what we actually build, I'm actually somewhat agnostic. At the end of the day, like I want to be a platform that like helps people build those types of applications.
In your mind, a lot of this is interchangeable data machine learning. I mean, to some extent.
I mean, a little bit. Like I don't know. Like AI is like has like set ups and downs. Like I think we had like whatever, like 4 AI winters or whatever. Like now, like AI is like a great term. I feel like 2020 AI was like a bad term. I used to say only like data. I'm just going to focus on data. There's been so many other like terms coming and going. Like to me, it's all the same. It's like data, right? Like you're working with data, and like sometimes you're training models. Sometimes you're doing, I don't know, like data pipelines and batch compute, but like at the end of the day, it's data.
And like we were talking about this market map. I do like the mad landscape every year, and that's a question I get every year because I steadfastly refuse to break it apart in in data infrastructure versus machine learning versus AI kind of thing. But that's exactly the point. Like for me, like all of this is completely tied together. But as a result, that's why it ends up being so populated.
Totally.
I'd love to get a little bit of a tour of the different pillars of the product and what it does currently.
So I think the core of it is really just like compute and running containers. That's where we started. Like we always had a vision of building a platform, but like the core of it is like we want to make it easy to run code in the cloud. And it turns out that like inference is such a killer use case for that effectively we spent the last like 3-4 years now like entirely focused on just like how do we take user code and execute in the cloud in a way where like, we handle the scaling and all the infrastructure. We sort of like let everything else like sort of wait until we really nail that experience. How that breaks down is under the hood. And we realized in order to deliver that experience, we had to kind of go deep in the layer of like the infrastructure and throw out a lot of existing stuff. Like in particular, one of the things I always cared about is like developer experience. Like I wanted to have, like almost like build a tool I always wanted to have through my own experience, like building these types of things. I didn't mention it, but like at Spotify, I built a music recommendation system. So it's a big part of like, my life used to be like, iterating and like shipping and deploying things and like, or like just running, various types of batch jobs and like, deploying and or debugging things. And at the core of that, like one thing I realized, for instance, was like, if you don't have like a good, super fast feedback loop, like you can never make so much of developer experience comes from having like a super fast feedback loop where you can like take code and execute it in the cloud in a way where it almost feels like it's local. And if you solve that problem, you solve a lot of different problems. Like you make engineers more productive because they can iterate and run things quickly. You sort of kind of, bridge the entire gap. You almost like, you basically get rid of the sort of, what I think was like the gap between local development and cloud development, which I think with AI and machine learning has always been a big challenge because you end up having like different environments, like different tool chains. And then, you end up having to take like research code and like repackage it and rerun it, in order to like get it out there in the cloud. So if you get rid of that like distinction between local and cloud and just turn it into like one environment, you always run things in the cloud, you solve a lot of different problems. But in order to do that, you have to make it fast. You have to make it feel like you're developing locally when you're running things in the cloud. So what we realized, like in order to do that, you have to solve a number of core technical challenges around container cold starting. So like what I mean is like you have to take code and you have to, ship it to the cloud and you have to start that container. And ideally you want to do that in like a couple of seconds at most, because that's like, sort of a human reaction speed. It's like kind of feels snappy. And then we started looking at, okay, well, what actually happens typically in a system when you do that is, you deploy something to Kubernetes and then, you have to pull down a Docker container image and that then has to start up. And all of those like steps are super inefficient. So we built our own, we threw out Kubernetes out the window, we threw out Docker out the window, we built our own file system in order to optimize for how container images are distributed. We built our own scheduler in order to maintain this pool of workers and make it possible to start tasks very quickly. We built our own container image builder because we had our own container image format. So, which is
That's
kind of
a huge effort. How long did that take?
I mean, it was like, too long. And this was during the ZERP era. So like, I feel like, VCs were like, yeah, cool. I mean, like people were like asking, like, why do you really have to go so deep? And, but fundamentally, I think, we felt like, we're going to solve this problem well. So we spent basically like, year and a half, 2 years, 2.5 years, like almost like in a cave, just like building a product that like no one had used, which is maybe a bad idea. And then like when we actually like kind of emerged out of that cave, turned out like we didn't really have like an obvious use case. So we struggled for like, 6 months or a year or so to try to find a use case. And then luckily all this like, Stable Diffusion came out in like summer of 2022 or something like that. And a lot of people started coming to us and like, actually, this kind of makes sense. Like you have this like serverless GPU thing you can sort of, and realize like this makes a lot of sense for us to focus on. And then we started seeing actual like more like meaningful like traction with like users.
The GPUs that I have access to through Modal, where are they? Where do you get the GPUs from?
They're like all over. So we use, and this is not a secret by the way, we use AWS, we use GCP, we use Oracle. We have a number of alternative cloud providers now that we're also using. And we run in a lot of different regions. We have a bunch of GPUs in the US. We have a bunch in Europe.
And it's part of the trick to be intelligent about which one you get where, when?
Yeah, totally. And for a few different reasons. Like one is just capacity management. Like, from from time to time, like capacity varies, right? Like there's sort of cyclicality. If you look at like Europe versus US, actually kind of interesting. You see like a lot of, when sort of, when it's like early morning, like you see like, US is not, high utilization, but like Europe has high utilization and vice versa. So you can play all these games kind of just like aggregating capacity across different regions. Pricing is the other obvious dimension, right? Like we actually have a system that continuously looks at cloud pricing and solves an optimization problem to sort of, figure out how do we allocate capacity across like, 100 different regions in order to deliver the capacity we need to our customers. Because we use a combination of reservations, but also a lot of like spot and on-demand capacity, which means like, we rely on the cloud's ability to scale up and down, which, because it's a sort of supply-demand matching problem, right? Like we have volatile demand coming from our customers, which means like ideally we also have, the ability to sort of match that with, on-demand capacity on the other side. Which is also like why I think we found a good product market fit with inference, because inference is inherently sort of unpredictable, right? Like you don't know necessarily, when you're deploying something, what the usage is going to be. There's going to be a lot of daily sort of, variation. It's going to be a lot of like weird spikes, when something goes viral, et cetera. And a big part of the pitch of Modal is, you can use us. We'll just scale automatically. You don't have to worry about, setting a, making a sort of cloud commitment, especially not, 3-year or, 1-year reservation. You can just like, deploy things on Modal. And then if you one day need 1,000 GPUs, we can typically get you 1,000 GPUs like pretty quickly, like talking minutes.
In terms of the model itself, I just bring my own model. Effectively, I go on Hugging Face and grab some open source model and deploy it on Modal.
Yeah, you can definitely like take a Hugging Face model and deploy it. That's what a lot of people use Modal for. I think where Modal really shines is also like people training their own models, like having custom model. Like one example I always bring up is like, amazing use case. I love the product is Suno. Which is AI generated music, and they have a big cluster. They train their own models outside of Modal, and then they use Modal for the inference side. So, which means like we run generate like all the sort of generation of AI generated music happens on Modal, like very large scale, right? Like we millions and millions of music generated on Modal.
Sort of full circle with the Spotify experience.
It's actually funny because sometimes when I talk to them, I end up talking a lot about like licensing and stuff like that. Music license, because I happen to know a lot about that. But yeah, so what I love about that is they can do what they're good at, which is to build an amazing user experience and a user application and train models. And for all the sort of infrastructure mess, they can effectively outsource that to Modal, and that happens to be something we love and we can do really well. So this is sort of I think that's sort of comparative advantage of specialization in that sense.
The training side would not make sense.
We are interested in training. We're looking at it. I think training like at very large scale, like people are very price sensitive, somewhat transactional. Like I think you have like very different sort of requirements, like typically like InfiniBand and like very high interconnect. It puts a lot of different, constraints on the infrastructure that we don't support today. It's something we're interested in, like, somewhat like, looking at down the road, but it's not like a super high priority for the business right now. I think, like another use case like Duo that we do support is actually like a lot of like pre-processing for training. So a lot of users use this for like, let's say you have, millions and millions of audio files or video files and you want to extract some training data from that. Like typically, that requires a sort of batch job that like, I don't know, extracts features from and that's something that Modal does really well too. It's like very high, like bursty, batch parallelism, just like fan out, like parallelized, run this over millions and millions of audio files or something like that.
And then you're done, right? So it's sort of the ability to be elastic and just like grow very quickly.
Totally,
and then
exactly.
Scale down.
Elasticity, sort of pay as you go, because everything in Modal is usage based. So you just pay for like the exact time your GPUs or CPUs run.
Fine tuning, is that emerging as an important?
I think fine tuning is like, a year ago I would have said like fine tuning is like absolutely critical. I think now they're like the models have gotten so good that like, this is sort of a question of like, is fine tuning even needed? I think fine tuning has a lot of different, use cases. I think in particular, if you have like very domain specific models, let's say you're like focused on like financial data or document extraction or something like that. I think fine tuning absolutely makes a ton of sense. And so we have a lot of users using Modal for that. I think beyond that, like, I don't know, like fine tuning is still to me like a little bit like an unproven thing, but clearly there's like certain places where it does make sense.
It's a fascinating comment actually in terms of like the current state of the AI market and where it's going, right? It sort of feels like we're just coming out of a big phase of training and fine tuning to some extent, which I guess is a part of training.
Yeah,
and
totally.
going into the world of okay, we build the things now, let's use them, which is the inference.
Exactly, yeah, and I mean also like a couple of years ago, a lot of companies trying to train their own LLMs. Like that to me, it makes almost no sense, right? Like, Mosaic and stuff like that. Like, so yeah, like I agree with you, right? Like, it's obvious that like in the long run, like inference spend will dominate, just for like the obvious reason that like that's where you make the money, right? Like, when you're training a big model, that's like, you're spending a lot of money training that model. How do you recoup that? Like, it's typically through inference, right? If you look at OpenAI and any of these businesses. So to me, it's very clear that like maybe in the past we've had like 80-20, spend GPUs, training versus inference. I think in the future it might be the other way around. Like, much more, more dollars will be spent on inference than training.
You mentioned batch processing, job queues and all that stuff, which is, in some way feels more like the sort of more classic data engineering part? Is that a big use case as well?
Yeah, I mean, like there's like a bunch of people using like us for like data parallelism and like pipelines and stuff. I mean, like there's like weird, like sort of unexpected use cases. I shouldn't say weird. It sounds like I'm dismissing that, but like actually the fascinating use cases, like we've seen in like biotech, for instance, like companies having, I don't know bio super well, so this might be like a gross generalized, bad sort of characterization, but like scanning like millions and millions of compounds for like certain chemical properties or like medical imaging where customers have millions of computer, like running computer vision on like millions of things coming from medical imaging. So there's a lot of like sort of batch processing also in those use cases I find fascinating. Not just like sort of data pipelines, which is what I think people think about with batch processing, but also all kinds of other interesting applications around biotech or video transcoding or feature extraction and things like that.
And to finish the tour, sandboxed code execution, what does that mean?
Yeah, like we started seeing a lot of customers like who build LLMs, like needing, especially like people like doing LLMs for code, needing safe code execution. As it happens, like we had great primitives for that because that's effectively what we built, right? Like we built like a system for like containing user code and executing in a safe way. So we started thinking about, can we expose that as a service? So we also have primitives to like take sort of untrusted code and execute that in a safe way. And I would like put that in sort of category of like unproven. Like it's still like sort of early days. We're trying to figure out exactly what that market opportunity looks like. But there's like so many startups like building LM for code, whether it's like code generation or migrations or things like that, or like other like debugging or things like that. So to me, that's like remains like an unproven, but like potentially very large upside like market opportunity for us that I'm pretty excited about.
Why did you pick serverless as the right level of abstraction for this space in terms of what developers need?
I think it's like funny because I feel like serverless was all that like hype. Like people were like really excited about it. Like when Lambda came, and then like it didn't really catch on. And like 10 years ago when like Lambda came, I actually don't remember what year Lambda came, but I think it's about 10 years ago. Like I probably would have expected like, in the future, like 90% of like, web development will obviously just be, people don't want to think about like containers and processes and things like that. And that didn't really happen. And I've thought a lot about like why, and like one of the reasons I've kind of realized like, maybe like the reason it didn't happen is like actually like the developer ergonomics around like building backend services is actually kind of fine. Like, if you're like a, backend developer just like deploying with Kubernetes or running things locally, it's actually not so bad. Like, it turns out like moving things to Lambda is actually like kind of worse in many ways. If you look at data teams though, like data AI, machine learning teams, like I think we never figured out developer ergonomics for those companies or for those teams. And like, 10 years ago, like I was the only data engineer, the only data scientist at Spotify, and it was kind of fine because it was like such a small, fringe part of like software engineering that like probably didn't really matter. But now there's a lot of people building data AI machine learning applications. And I think developer ergonomics and developer experience matters so much more. And as it turns out, actually like serverless kind of makes sense, I think, for a lot of the applications that those people are building. So serverless always felt to me like, in hindsight, looks like the right idea, but applied to the wrong problems. And I always like wondered, now like I'm looking at like what we built at Modal, like I'm kind of convinced that like serverless actually makes a lot more sense for like data AI machine learning applications for a lot of different reasons. But like you have like very bursty things, you have a lot of different containers, you don't necessarily care about like hyper low latency. I think there's a lot of different reasons why it's actually like makes a lot of sense for those types of use cases.
As any great entrepreneur, you've been very focused and you seem to have said no to like self-hosting kind of scenarios. Where do you, first of all, is it correct? And second, just walk us through the thinking.
Yeah, and it's something we're like still debating to a large extent, right? And by the way, I think of it like self-hosting and not just kind of a binary. It's kind of a spectrum, right? There's like on-prem on one side. There's like sort of fully multi-tenant on the other side, and there's a bunch of stuff in the middle. There's VPC peering, private link, cloud prem, BYOC, bring your own cloud. So it's actually kind of more of a spectrum. But we've been sort of cloud maximalists, and we've been all in on like, let's just build like a multi-tenant service where we just run everyone's code in our cloud environment. And to be clear, like a lot of customers are just not, a lot of potential customers is not, comfortable with that model. I tend to think about that as like the cloud itself. I'm old enough that like I started my career pre-cloud, and I remember the first time I heard about AWS, in 2007, 2008 or something when they launched. Like my first reaction was like, how could anyone ever run their code in someone else's computer? That's nuts, right? And then like just a few years later, I was like doing it myself, and I was like, this is awesome. And then like I think there's like sort of a similar thinking. I met with the Snowflake team like when they're still building the product super early, and I was like, why would anyone put their own data in like Snowflake's data warehouse running in the cloud? But now like they have like very large enterprise customers like are very comfortable with that. And so I think the general wind is like blowing in the direction of like multi-tenancy and like, security moving away from the sort of network layer into the app layer and a bunch of different other things. And I think one trap that I think a lot of startups fall into is that, you go out and talk to a lot of customers and they sort of insist on self-hosting. In my opinion, like, sometimes that's actually like a true like hard concerns. But in many cases, it's actually more of a soft concern. And it really just means like you haven't built a product that they're desperate enough to use. And so, maybe one day we will open up and offer other deployment models. But I'm actually more interested in the other option. Like, how come, we haven't built a product that they're desperate enough for us to use, right? Can we push more in that angle? Can we make it so good that they're willing to waive the sort of typical concerns around deployment model and embrace this like fully multi-tenant model where we run everything in the cloud? Because the benefits are very tremendous. Like I really think of like resource pooling is like one of the free lunches that exists in sort of, in the cloud economics. You can get much faster capacity and much more liquid, capacity, et cetera.
Just double click on that. What does that mean, resource pooling?
I mean, like, like if you have like a lot of different people and they all have like very volatile demand, like if you just like put those, pools together, like you can actually scale it much more efficiently and drive much higher utilization than if you sort of separate it and say, each one of you has to run your own pool of compute, right?
The spectrum between self-hosted or on-prem to cloud maximalism is something we think about a lot as well. I mean, there does seem to be a somewhat surprising pull towards on-prem these days or self-hosted. Why do you think that is?
I think it's just easier to grow your business that way, right? Like, a lot of companies, like, first of all, like for a lot of products, like it's not like necessarily like a core impact on revenue, right? Like if you're building a SaaS business and, self-hosting versus, multi-tenancy, like if you fundamentally charge roughly the same thing or maybe even more for self-hosting, I don't know, like then it doesn't really, make big difference. And if the quality of the service is kind of similar, then like, why even like, bother like insisting, right? Like let's just like go and meet the customers where their demand is. For us, I think the product is much better with the multi-tenant service, and the revenue potential is much larger because we have full control over the underlying COGS, like the underlying cost, and we can do all these optimizations. So for us, I think there's more of a case to be made for like pushing for this thing. For many other types of business, I don't think it matters that much, and so I think they're better off just like meeting the customers where they are. But I do think there's a lot of customers also, a lot of vendors out there that like maybe they should push more for like, sort of cloud maximalist approach. Because I do think like, that's where, I kind of feel like that's where things are going. Who knows? Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe like, in a year or two, like if we do this podcast again, like I've been like, giving up and just like banging my head against like all these, late stage, enterprise customers. And I've just given in and said, actually, you know what? Like there's a big business in on-prem. And maybe that's fine. I don't know. But right now, that's just not where I want to focus my energy.
I know that you already decrease your price once to reflect a decrease in the price of GPUs. But how do you think about that layer of value between what the GPU vendors or the cloud providers that provide the GPU, what they charge you and what you charge to customers?
Yeah, I think fundamentally, like through our software, we have the ability to charge more than the underlying GPU costs. Now, like how much more is the question, right? Like customers would probably freak out if we charge 10x more, because then they're just going to go, actually, you know what? Like, as much as I like the developer experience of Modal, I'm not going to pay 10x. I'm just going to go deploy it directly on like whatever, Lambda Labs or something like that. And so the question is like, how much more can we charge? And it's like probably like 2 to 3x. I think, like one of the things I always like think about is like, are we a WeWork? Like in the sense that like, do we make like long-term GPU reservations and then we have like short-term sort of, income, and then like, we have this like massive sort of, exposure to the underlying, costs. And
then you can have a GPU adjusted EBITDA.
Yeah. I think, probably like the answer to that is like, we need to be a little bit more conscious, like not making like enormous, like, spending a lot of capital on like, very long-term reservations, especially in like this climate right now where like no one can predict the GPU prices. GPU prices themselves like are like, kind of strange, right? Like for a while, like H100 prices were like almost like going up, and then they were kind of still for a while. And then now they're like actually going down quite a lot, like, what I'm seeing in the market, right? And so we have to be cognizant of that and like lower the price. Like, does that make us commodity? Like, I don't know. Like, I look at like AWS, right? Like, you can argue like, is AWS a commodity? Are they not? But like at the end of the day, like EC2 is like what, like, 50, 60, 70% margins. It's actually, not as much of a commodity as like people think. So like, I think the value of software and the value of, creating this like pool of, liquid capacity, lets you actually have decent amount of pricing power. And in the long run, like I also think there's many other like add-on services we can, charge for that, as we go up in a stack that lets us, retain like decent margins. I also think a lot about like GPU prices, like what happens if they crash? What happens if they go up? Like, are we long or short GPU prices? But like fundamentally, I actually think that, since we're like sort of, the value we create is like the software on top of the GPUs, that, in a way, like if GPU prices were to crash, like the relative value of that software actually goes up. So like, I'm not necessarily sure that like a crash in GPU would be bad for us. I think it actually could be great for us because, if GPU prices go down, there's going to be more applications using GPUs. So, and then people are going to pay more for software, just like they do for CPU, by the way. Like, margins on Lambda is much higher than margins on GPU serverless products. So I spend a lot of time thinking about this, but I do think there's a lot of pricing power in like building infrastructure as a service in this space.
What do you think that is? What do you think you nailed to be able to get that amount of love and interest?
I think we did a few things right, which is like, one was just like me just, building kind of the product I always wanted to have and just being kind of opinionated about like what that looks like. And then not being afraid to actually go deep into sort of layers of infrastructure and like change things that sort of got in the way of like delivering that experience. To me, it's like we live and die by the quality of the ergonomics of the tool. And so to me, that's like the core competitive advantage. That's the sort of, core ethos of the company. Like we cannot absolutely lose that. That's why people pick Modal. Everything else is sort of, secondary. I also have a long background in building consumer products my whole career, so I think that's maybe helped. Kind of thinking about, what is the onboarding experience? Like, what does it feel like? It's sort of unboxing. Like, when you get started, you download a client, like install it, and like, like what does that feel like? I think that's like kind of often like a missed opportunity to like create the sort of set the expectation that this is a magic tool. So spending a lot of time thinking about that, I think, it was also sort of inherently led to more like a, bottoms up sort of, go to market approach. As we're so focused on developer experience. But yeah, just being like obsessed and maniacal, like thinking about like what the, SDK looks like.
Yeah. And you just published a few weeks ago, a really cool blog post, actually a little bit on that topic, right, of sort of onboarding experience, or at least a part of the blog post was about the onboarding experience and how you make sort of the complex easy. Do you want to summarize maybe some of the ideas?
Yeah, so like, what I wrote about is like generally it's just like how do you write code when you're writing code for humans when like the human, like when the actual end user of that code is like a human. Like I'm talking specifically about like, like packages, frameworks, even like programming languages. Like how do you think about, code when the end consumer of that code is a human? So, how do you make the, think about their mental model, their onboarding experience, making it easy for those people to take your code and, and as building blocks and compose larger things. And a lot of those things, are just kind of things I've been thinking a lot about, for the last 10, 15 years, like building things like Luigi, and other things, and Modal, of course, now. And to me, it's like, it's actually not like rocket science. There's like a bunch of just like very core principles of just like, how do you craft this like experience that makes, a great experience. And, like for Modal, it's like so important. We like focused, everything we can on that. But I actually kind of feel like it's like somewhat repeatable for many other people too.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe it was a really interesting post, and we'll put it in the show notes and all the things. But like, what were some of the core ideas. I think there was a part about having less, not explaining the whole thing from A to Z, but like showing examples of the final product and what that looks like and what happens if you remove one part or the other.
Yeah, exactly. I think, yeah. I mean, there's so many products where like like so many dev tools, or you go check out some like code on GitHub, and it's like you want to like maybe this is interesting, maybe not, and you're like all it says in the README is how to configure it and how to install it, but not actually showing an example of how to run it. And like I'm like the least patient person in the world, and there's like 50 billion gazillion dev tools out there, and like so many GitHub packages and whatever. Like so, like when I encounter like something like that, I just don't have the energy to sort of visualize like how does this fit into my code base. And so I think it's such a lost opportunity. It's like for all these like dev tools, like show me some examples, like show me like how to build something, like I don't know. Maybe my mind is different than other people. Like I just don't understand when I look at like core concepts, like stuff like that. When like I look at a dev tool and like it starts out like introducing a bunch of like weird things. Like I just don't have the energy to like kind of visualize how those would fit together to solve the problem that I have. I'd rather much like look at an example that sort of reminds me of the problem I'm trying to solve. Like a lot of this actually goes back to like my time at Spotify and kind of what Spotify optimized for. It's kind of a weird, very different product, obviously, but like it has a lot of analogs. And one of the things I think Spotify did incredibly well was sort of first experience of like you download Spotify and you search for music and you like double click on it and it like just plays music. And like you do that within like a couple of seconds, right? Like it's so obvious, it's so visceral almost. You're like, it's funny. It actually goes beyond that. Is you're like, is this music streaming in the cloud? Like, but it's like feels like it's local, right? And that's like, anyway, like exactly the sort of experience I wanted to have with Modal, right? It's like, is this code running in the cloud? Like, no, it's actually running, or like it is running in the cloud, right? So and like nailing that sort of first experience and setting that expectation for like like this is how the entire product is going to be. Like to me, that's like a big part of how do you like sort of make a magic developer experience, as well as many other consumer products. It goes well beyond sort of developer tools. But I build dev tools, so that's why I write blog posts about that. So to me, that's like that's a lost opportunity in many dev tools, and that's why we spend so much. I mean, to the point of like having a bunch of frivolous stuff. Like we have like silly like confetti stuff in the web browser and stuff like it, which maybe went too far. But I'd rather go too far like making the experience, like the onboarding experience, magical. Because it really sets that expectation.
Do you cut stuff as well when you look at the product? It's like, oh, this is too complicated, and like after the fact, you just like remove and simplify.
Yeah, we probably should do that even more. But yeah, we definitely cut out like a bunch of features that are like rarely used in order to sort of simplify the SDK. If something is like not really used by more than like some small minority of customers, like I'd rather just like get rid of it and sort of merge it into some like larger concept and make it like a special case or something else in order to sort of reduce the number of concepts you need to learn.
Those developers that show you so much love, a lot of them seem to be working at great companies like Ramp and CodeGen, Substack, and a bunch of others. How did you find them, or how did they find you? What's your sort of early go-to-market motion, I guess, to use VC terms?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it's like Twitter shit posting. It's like, like
I knew this had an actual use case.
Yeah, exactly. Reinforcing. So I don't know. I'm trivializing a little bit. But like I think I mean, I have a background in consumer products, and I always like had like been tweeting and blogging and stuff like that. So to me, I think every company has to find their own sort of channel mix, and they're all like go to market, and everything is like idiosyncratic, and like there's no like thing that really translates. For us, it just turned out that like targeting sort of like early data influencers and like talking about the product and like I don't know, like giving away hats online on Twitter, like to us that's always like worked for us. And I think now I'm like more recently, like, we hired our first salesperson 6 months ago, and, I'm trying to figure that out. And like, to me, that's like a whole different world. So I maybe that's like a different conversation we should have in like a year or two, like, what that looks like. I don't know. But I think that's the next step. So almost everything is inbound so far.
That moment is always very interesting in the life of a company, right? So the salesperson, what do they do? Do they take some of the inbound and just like have that first conversation? And I know you're figuring it out, but like, what do they do currently?
Yeah, I mean, there's a fair bit of that. I also think fundamentally, like, when you look at like later stage companies, like I do think that a more traditional sales model will make sense, for those companies. Like if you're selling to, I don't know, I mean, like an extreme case would be like Bank of America. Like you can't expect them to like, sign up using GitHub and just like start writing code and deploying things and swipe a credit card, right? Like there's going to be some procurement process. There's going to be, some proof of concept. There's going to be a bunch of other stuff. So we're trying to figure out exactly how that looks like and how it fits into our model. We've been very like happy, with the inbound and just like kind of upselling, and like that's been, enough to get to the point where we are. But I also think like layering on some sort of top down, will help us get to the next layer. I look at, to me, like actually like the best companies and that I look at for inspiration would be like, Datadog or Mongo or something like that. Like started with or AWS actually, frankly, like started with a product that customers loved and nailed the sort of, bottoms up, like, self-service process. But then also, once that got to a certain point, started layering on like more of a top-down, like traditional sales process.
Yeah. You've had some interesting thoughts on how to manage the team in terms of giving them a lot of leeway. What is your philosophy on managing that early engineering team?
I think that in the early days, actually like, mid-stage too, like you can get very far with almost no management. And the sort of, and I look at like a lot of like the lessons from like early Spotify days. Like Spotify probably went too far. Like no one told me who my manager was for the first year at Spotify, which is probably bad. But I think it's sort of an extreme example of like the sort of freedom under responsibility that existed in the early days of Spotify. Like at the end of the day, like people were super commercial in building the stuff that they thought was the best for the company. And kind of self-organized around that. There's a little bit of like Scrum and stuff like that, but actually I think that was kind of bad. So to me, like, the sort of, like, I'm not naive about it, but I think aspirationally, like, you can get very close to like self-organization if you just hire like fairly smart people, very entrepreneurial people, competitive people who, and just give them the context. You just like tell them like, this is what we're trying to build, and then you go figure it out. And then obviously, like as you grow, then you're gonna have to like kind of put things in different swim lanes and have a little bit more like project management. But you can actually get much further, which a lot less of that than people think is my experience. And you're actually better off doing that because you sort of retain people's autonomy. You retain people's ability to sort of come up with solutions themselves. Especially when you're smart people, like they want to do that, and you should do that. And you should harness the creativity of the sort of the largest surface area, which is at the sort of the individual contributors.
And how does that work on a daily basis? Because you sort of don't manage them, but ultimately manage them at the same time by virtue of being the CEO. Is like, do you like catch up, or they come to you when they have a problem, or you just look at the final product? Like, how does that work?
Yeah, I think you can look at, the final product. You can talk about what they're working on. Like, I don't, necessarily believe in those sort of estimates or deadlines or things like that. But I do think there's an element of like looking across the portfolio of your current project and like continuously sort of adjusting. Are we spending too much time on this? Are we spending not enough time on this other thing? Sort of continuously adjusting that. Every month we do like a lightweight sort of, set the priorities for the month and like here are the things we're trying to accomplish. Communicate with all the teams, make sure there's nothing that's missing, sort of the MISI, like, you have everything covered and there's nothing that's missing. But that's like a Notion doc. That's like super, very basic. And then, we do track things in linear, like, but for most of the sort of day-to-day management, it's like people just come in and write a lot of code.
You had an interesting tweet a few weeks ago. The only correct way to add a new skill / function at a company. I don't know if you recall off the top of your head, but you can comment on it, like from doing the thing yourself, like that evolution.
Yeah, it was just a kind of reflection of like sort of how I've always built functions at startups is, like you can skip steps, but it's like generally kind of a bad idea to like, let's say you're not doing sales and suddenly you go from that to like, let's hire a VP of sales. Like now you're skipping like three steps or maybe more, right? Like the correct way, I think, to build up like sales, and by the way, like this is like probably the thing I have the least experience with, but like is like, you know, like, or like HR or like finance or whatever, is like, you know, you start doing it yourself. And then like eventually like that's, you know, you hit a wall and it's like taking up way too much time. Then, you know, you can delegate to someone, or you can sort of find like a part-time contractor or something like that. And then eventually that takes up, you know, too much time. So, you know, you convert that into a full-time person. And then eventually like, you know, you realize you need more people. And then, you know, you bring in someone else, you know, or you bring in additional people. You should manage that team initially too. And then eventually, like, you promote one of those people into leader, and then you can manage fewer people. But I think skipping steps in that sort of, you know, growing teams is kind of dangerous, because, you know, how are you going to manage you know, say a sales team unless you know how to run sales and how to do sales yourself? To me, that seems like very hard. Like, I think you kind of need to do it yourself first. Not to, you know, not you know, like, you know, for 10 years, but like do it for a little bit, and then, you know, eventually, you know, you hire people and, you know, promote people, and then you can manage the people.
We still, I guess, on the tail end of a period where like people thought that building a technical company in New York was sort of impossible. You know, even when proven otherwise by Mongo and Datadog. But you know, any current thoughts on, you know, building in New York versus other places?
I mean, I know I only built a company in New York, so I don't really know. Like, I don't know what the kind of. I'm sure there's like, you know, many reasons to build things in San Francisco or elsewhere. I just happen to live in New York, and I think New York has like an amazing talent pool. Like, if I lived in, you know, whatever, Jacksonville, I probably would have moved. But I don't. I think New York has such a good talent pool that, like, you know, you can totally build a company here and like build a very large one and be very successful, as evident by the company you mentioned. So I'm very happy to, you know, I just love the city. You know, I have wife and kids here. Like, I'm not going to move in order to start a company, and, you know, and luckily New York is a great place to build these types of companies.
So, newsflash to everyone: 2 European guys who chose to live in New York and work in tech do think that tech in New York is great.
I think tech in New York is amazing. I actually think, like, on that European thing, you know, like, I grew up in Sweden, right, and I still have a network in Sweden. So one of the things we've done at Modal is to hire a bunch of people in Sweden. And that's actually something I think New York is like very good for, right? Like, if you're a European founder or you know, have access to European talent, you know, we have many examples of that. I think, you know, I think Datadog has a bunch of people in France, for instance. Yeah. They're French founders, and with the time zones, it's much easier, right, than SF, right? Because it's like you have a 6-hour difference. You can actually have a decent overlap and coordinate across the time. And there's such amazing technical talent in Europe, especially like low-level stuff, you know, Linux, containers, like whatever, like the kind of stuff that we need. So for us, that's been a great sort of competitive advantage is having a team in Stockholm. It's still pretty small. There's 6 people, but they're very, very core contributors to like the infrastructure.
What are you building next in terms of a roadmap you can share?
I mean, like, I hope to build this for the next 20 years. So, like, I think there's so much stuff we want to build. Like, right now, like, we're focusing a lot on just like taking the existing compute platform and improving it in various ways. Like, one thing, for instance, like, I'm very focused on, like, how can we get into more like real time, like low latency use cases, which is like kind of an annoyingly complex technical problem. Like, we've sort of, you know, relied on like a centralized control plane running in one single region, US East 1. But we sort of recognized in order to get to sort of latencies below, you know, 150, 200 milliseconds, we probably need to split that up and run like a decentralized control plane. So that's going to take a long time too.
What's an example of
like speech to speech? Speech to speech, I think, is really exciting, like real-time translations or voice manipulations, or you know, there's a lot of interesting use cases around that, or video, actually, like another use case. So low latency stuff is like something we're really interested in focusing on. We're interested in like kind of, you know, pushing the boundaries of like very large scale batch processing. Modal right now, when you start, you know, doing, you know, millions of function calls, you know, or billions, like you start to run up against limits. But we're very interested in like, how can we push that into like, you know, millions and billions of like in a reliable way, so you can truly run this like very large scale like batch. That's another thing. So we're very focused on over the next 6 months. And what else? Like, you know, I think as we go up this, you know, as we sort of mature the sort of compute layer, I think there's many opportunities to go up the stack and sort of build more sort of enterprise features, build more sort of observability into the tool. We're very interested in like, you know, deepening our sort of enterprise security compliance offerings, and sort of, you know, less sort of technical side, but like, you know, SOC 2 type 2 and like I don't know, like we're going to be available on the AWS marketplace pretty soon. Like things like that, I think is kind of exciting too.
Any prediction on AI? Like you have a front row seat for like what people are building. I mean, do you see any I don't know, current pattern in terms of like is excitement slowing down, plateauing, accelerating? Are we at the beginning of all of this?
I think we're so early. Like, I don't know. It's like weird, right? Like to me, like the best analog would be like, either like fiber optics or like mobile or something like that. And I still think they're kind of like bad analogs. But one thing I, for instance, like thought a lot about is, the applications that in the long run tends to be sticky is like the type of things that really truly take advantage of like sort of like things that couldn't be built previously. And, that's why I'm like really excited about Suno, for instance. Like Suno is like a product that like clearly couldn't have existed like, a few years ago. And I also think like music is kind of always like a good sort of place where you tend to see like new applications pretty early. And like, similar to mobile, like I've been asking myself like, what's the like sort of Uber or Spotify of Instagram of AI? Like what's like the sort of consumer application that is like AI native in a certain way, right? Like, and I don't know if it's like ChatGPT. Like, I think ChatGPT is like, fantastic in many ways, but it feels like, I don't know if it's like long term, it feels like, I'm looking for something that's like a little bit more consumery and something that's like a little bit more vertical and is like truly AI native. And I don't know if we've seen that quite yet. I think something like Suno is like probably the closest to I see as that is in that vein. But that would be like what I would be looking forward to.
Thank you so much, Eric. Thanks for coming by and sharing all of this. And very exciting to see what you're building right here in New York.
It's great. Yeah.
Hi, it's Matt Turk again. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Mad Podcast. If you enjoyed it, we'd be very grateful if you would consider subscribing if you haven't already, or leaving a positive review or comment on whichever platform you're watching this or listening to this episode from. This really helps us build the podcast and get great guests. Thanks, and see you at the next episode.